began in 1936 in the frozen plains of Manchuria. The Japanese called the place Pingfang, just south of Harbin. Near the Songhua River, the maps labeled it Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The villagers called it what it really was. The Devil's Factory. The man who built it arrived in a fur-lined coat and arrogance thick enough to survive the cold. Lieutenant General Shirō Ishii, Imperial Army Medical Corps. A genius, they said, educated at Kyoto Imperial University, obsessed with bacteria, cleanliness, and control. He promised Tokyo he could make disease a weapon, not a plague to heal the sick, but a plague that would kill by the thousands and leave no bullet trace. He was given land, soldiers, engineers, and a budget no scientist in Japan could dream of. The compound rose in snow and smoke. Red brick laboratories, water towers, barracks, autopsy halls. The walls were 10 feet thick. The guards wore gas masks instead of faces. Every gate carried a sign with 2 words, no entry. Inside, Ishii's men moved like ghosts in white coats. They spoke softly, recorded everything, and laughed rarely. Their mission was written in coded memos, to improve defense through infection. What it meant was learning how long a man could live with plague in his blood, how far cholera could travel on a hot day, how fast frostbite could kill a soldier on the Manchurian front. By winter, the first logs arrived. That was the word they used for human subjects, maruta, logs. They came by train from occupied villages, Chinese farmers, Russian captives, Korean partisans, even a few Allied prisoners taken by the Kwantung Army. They were told they would be vaccinated. Some were told nothing at all. The buildings smelled of formalin and cold iron. The rooms had drains in the floor. White sheets covered tables that were never used for rest. In one, a surgeon named Dr. Wakamatsu sterilized scalpels while humming. In another, Ishii himself examined cages full of rats. The rats were carriers, breeding vessels for fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, plague. The fleas were bred by the millions in glass cylinders stacked like beehives. Technicians shook them gently to keep them alive. In February 1937, the first controlled infections began. Prisoners were injected with diluted cultures. Some were tied to posts outside to observe natural spread. The guards took notes in the cold, timing the fever, the swelling, the collapse. When the subjects died, the bodies were opened immediately. Organs were weighed, lungs measured, blood drawn into labeled jars. Ishii's men wrote everything down. The handwriting was careful, almost elegant. They called it medical research. They said it was for the emperor. By autumn, new experiments expanded into frostbite studies. Prisoners' arms were plunged into ice water until the skin froze solid. One lieutenant noted that a frozen limb, when struck with a cane, made a sound like wood. The data sheets measured color change, time to necrosis, resistance to gangrene. When the ice melted, the doctors sliced away the dead flesh to observe the border of living tissue. They recorded that too. Every evening, Ishii hosted dinners in his quarters. Officers drank sake and discussed infection rates as if they were crop yields. He liked to remind them that Japan must win with science, not superstition. They toasted to that while the furnaces outside burned waste from the day's dissections. By 1938, the compound had grown into a self-contained town, over 150 buildings, 3,000 personnel, its own railway spur. Villages nearby saw black smoke and smelled sweet rot but never spoke aloud. They knew what happened to those who asked questions. From the air, the site looked like a modern hospital complex. From the ground, it looked like a graveyard that hadn't learned it was one yet. Some nights, trucks arrived after dark carrying new prisoners. The guards unloaded them in silence. Inside, clerks filled out forms stamped EP Unit 731, Specimen Intake. Each form had a date, a number, a brief note. Male, age 32, farmer, temperature 37.2 degree A. The rest of the line was left blank, space for the death time. The program was expanding. Ishii wanted plague bombs, ceramic shells that could burst above enemy cities and scatter infected fleas. He ordered engineers to build wind tunnels to test dispersion patterns. He even designed porcelain casings himself, thin enough to shatter on impact but thick enough to survive launch. Every failure meant another round of field verification. In late 1939, after a test village downriver was mysteriously wiped out by fever, Tokyo doubled his funding. The emperor's advisors sent him a note of commendation. Ishii smiled and wrote back, "Victory through bacteria." Inside the walls of Pingfang, victory smelled like decay. When the war in China dragged on, Ishii's reports claimed promising progress. The charts showed infection curves that peaked faster every month. He bragged that 1 kilogram of plague culture could kill an entire city if deployed correctly. He spoke of it as precision, not horror. Meanwhile, his subordinates perfected vivisection techniques, surgery on living subjects without anesthesia to observe organ reaction. They timed heartbeats, kidney failure, brain swelling. The doctors wore gloves, but no remorse. When an experiment ended, they burned the bodies in the compound's crematorium and cleaned the tables for the next morning. The camp never slept. Lights glowed through the fog at all hours. The sound of generators hummed beneath the wind. Guards patrolled with bayonets and dogs. The only music was the click of instruments and the scratch of pens writing death into data. Ishii's ambition fed on success. In 1940, he ordered construction of new chambers for pressure and temperature testing. Some subjects were exposed to simulated high altitudes until their eyes burst. Others were sealed in vacuum tanks to study decompression sickness. The notes recorded, "Useful for aviation medicine." By then, Unit 731 was a secret empire within the empire. Few in Tokyo understood the full scope. Those who did called it Maruda science. Ishii called it progress. Outside the walls, war consumed the continent. Inside, the war was distilled into numbers, pulse rate, temperature, hours until death. And beneath it all lay Ishii's promise that Japan would win not with bullets but with bacteria. He was wrong. But in 1940, no one in Pingfang could imagine defeat. The furnaces still burned, the snow still fell, and the Devil's Factory kept its silence. The winters in Manchuria were long enough to erase color from everything. 1941 froze Pingfang in silence. Steam rose from the chimneys of Unit 731, a steady ghost above the snow. The locals said that if the wind blew from the north, you could smell sweet decay on the air. No one ever asked what it was. Inside, the men in white coats worked through the cold without gloves. The smell of carbolic acid clung to their uniforms. On their desks sat rows of glass jars labeled in neat handwriting. Bacillus anthracis, Vibrio cholerae, Yersinia pestis. Each one was a weapon more loyal than any soldier. Dr. Shirō Ishii walked the corridors like a man inspecting a temple. His boots echoed against the tiles. He carried a clipboard and a cigarette, moving from lab to lab as if the walls themselves were listening. Behind every door, something alive was dying for the empire. The compound had grown. New wings for pathology, surgery, animal testing, kennels filled with dogs, pens of pigs and goats, rat cages stacked to the ceiling, fleas swarming behind glass. Each morning, technicians fed the rats millets soaked in infected blood. They counted fleas under microscopes, measured their reproduction rates, then crushed a few to confirm infection under the lens. It was science in its purest, cruelest form. In one building, Dr. Hisato Yoshimura led the frostbite team. They tied prisoners outdoors in sub-zero temperatures, pouring water on exposed limbs until the skin froze white. Guards struck the limbs with bamboo rods. If it made a dull sound, the doctor noted, frozen to the bone. Victims were then thawed in warm water to measure tissue death. Yoshimura kept the severed parts for dissection. He believed his data would save Japanese pilots shot down over Siberia. He wrote to Tokyo, "Sacrifice of the few ensures survival of the many." In another building, surgeons performed vivisections. The term sounded clean in the reports. In the rooms themselves, it meant living men strapped to tables, their organs exposed while still beating. The surgeons wore masks in silence. They observed heart motion, lung inflation, brain response to trauma. They injected air into arteries to study embolisms. They recorded everything. No one spoke of murder. Only measurement. The prisoners, called Maruta, logs, were kept in cells beneath the labs. Each morning, guards selected a few. The rest waited, counting days by the footsteps overhead. One interpreter later testified that the prisoners sometimes heard Ishii himself humming while walking past their doors. The sound meant the day's experiments were about to begin. By mid-1941, the research moved beyond the walls. Ishii had designed ceramic bombs that could release plague-infected fleas from the air. The prototypes were filled in the entomology wing, technicians wearing gauze masks, pouring black specks of life into porcelain shells. Each shell carried thousands of infected fleas, bred from the rats of Pingfang. They were stored in crates marked fragile medical instruments. In August, test flights began. Planes from the Imperial Army's 2nd Air Division flew over remote regions of Manchuria, dropping the bombs over small villages. Within a week, reports came of high fever, swelling, and death. Ishii's men traveled to the villages dressed as doctors, taking samples from the dying. They brought them back in labeled jars. The official report called it successful field verification. The Emperor was informed in coded language. The Water Purification Division reports promising results. Funding doubled again. The next year, 1942, saw new diseases added to the collection: typhus, cholera, dysentery. The infection rooms became production lines. Prisoners were deliberately infected, their fluids harvested to grow new cultures. Technicians worked 12-hour shifts, sterilizing instruments, feeding the bacterial vats with nutrients, monitoring growth rates like farmers tending crops. Each week, Ishii inspected the petri dishes, his reflection staring back in the glass. "Our seeds of victory," he called them. He ordered his men to develop a device that could spray bacteria from aircraft over wide areas. They tested it on open fields, then on live targets. Prisoners were tied to stakes in formation. The device was activated upwind. Observers in gas masks recorded time to infection. When the wind shifted, some of the guards got sick. They were quietly buried behind the incinerator. The official logs never mentioned them. By the summer of 1943, Unit 731 had infected entire provinces. Plague outbreaks in Ningbo and Changde killed thousands. The Japanese press called it mysterious illness. Ishii called it data. He ordered more flea production. The goal: enough for 50 kilograms of plague-infested insects every month. Enough to erase a city. Inside the compound, the atmosphere changed. Some scientists began to whisper that the war was turning. The Americans were advancing in the Pacific. The Soviets were moving west. But in Pingfang, the war felt eternal, sealed away from time, preserved in ice and formaldehyde. One night, during a blackout drill, an assistant named Araki stumbled into a holding cell. He saw the prisoners sitting silently in the dark, eyes reflecting the faint light of his lantern. He dropped the lamp and ran. Later, he wrote in his diary, "They looked at me like men who had already died, waiting for science to finish its paperwork." In the officers' club, laughter still echoed. They played cards, sang songs about the emperor. Ishii drank sake and told stories about his travels to Europe. "The Germans respect order," he said, "but they lack imagination. We will go further." He had begun studying reports of German chemical weapons research. He wanted to outdo them. He ordered collaboration with the Imperial Navy to test biological agents on prisoners at sea. Some were taken to islands near Port Arthur and exposed to aerosolized anthrax. None survived long enough for full data. Ishii's notes recorded, "Need to refine delivery for longer incubation." Even as Japan's fortunes declined, his faith in science did not. He built a new incinerator larger than before. He designed it personally, claiming it was for animal disposal. The smoke from its chimney carried the scent of formalin and bone ash. By late 1943, whispers of surrender had reached even the outer provinces. But Ishii told his men the empire's destiny was divine. He promised them glory when victory came: professorships, promotions, medals. He believed it, or wanted to. Each night, the furnaces burned until dawn. The snow outside was stained gray. The world beyond the walls might have been ending. But inside Pingfang, the machines of death ran on schedule. Thermometers were checked, samples logged, bodies measured. Everything precise, everything pure, and still, they called it medicine. When one technician asked Ishii how long they would continue, he smiled and said, "Until the empire is safe." He didn't say from what. The year was 1944, and the empire was bleeding. Cities burned under American bombs. The sea turned against the rising sun, and yet in Manchuria the smoke from Pingfang still rose every morning, steady as ever. The war was ending everywhere except here. Trains kept arriving with crates marked medical supplies. Inside were plague bombs. Ishii called them uji bombs, ceramic shells filled with fleas bred from infected rats. He still believed he could turn the tide by unleashing one perfect epidemic. To him, war was no longer fought with guns, but with incubation periods. The first large field test began near the Chinese city of Ningbo. The planes flew low, releasing clouds of fleas over farmland. Villagers looked up at the falling dust, thinking it was fertilizer. Within days, fevers spread. The infection crept through houses, wells, markets. By the time Japanese medical teams arrived in protective suits, the dead lay in doorways. They collected samples and burned the village to contain contamination. The experiment was labeled successful. In Pingfang, Ishii gathered his officers in the main hall. He pointed at maps dotted with red ink. "Every red mark," he said, "is proof that science wins wars." The men applauded. Outside, technicians were burying their own comrades who had accidentally inhaled anthrax spores. The logs omitted them. Science had no room for error that bled the wrong flag. That spring, new directives came from Tokyo. Accelerate plague bomb production for possible use against advancing Soviet forces. Ishii expanded the insectary, filling entire rooms with rat cages and flea towers. The smell was unbearable. Workers sprayed disinfectant by the gallon, but the scent of rot clung to everything. They wrapped their faces in gauze and kept writing data. Rumors reached the compound that American pilots had been captured in Manchuria. Ishii requested access to them for aviation medicine. Several were transferred from Mukden prison. Guards were told the tests involved high-altitude physiology. The Americans never came back. Their records vanished into files labeled confidential, material used. By late summer, the Kwantung Army was losing ground. Soviet armor gathered beyond the Amur River. Inside the compound, the doctors pretended not to hear. Ishii's voice still carried the confidence of a man who believed the empire immortal. He lectured his staff about post-war glory. "When peace returns, our research will make Japan the leader of the new world." No one corrected him. In the autumn of 1944, plague bombs were loaded for another field operation, this time near Changde. The pilots took off before dawn. Ishii watched from the runway, gloved hands behind his back, frost forming on his coat. He whispered, "Victory through purity." The bombs shattered over the city, scattering thousands of infected fleas. Within weeks, the epidemic spread beyond control. The disease killed not only Chinese civilians, but also hundreds of Japanese soldiers stationed nearby. Reports to Tokyo described it as an unfortunate accident. The term became standard in official language. Inside Unit 731, the mood shifted. Scientists avoided each other's eyes. The laughter in the mess hall died. The war was clearly lost, but Ishii demanded larger experiments. He argued they had to finish the data set before surrender. In early 1945, he approved mass infections with anthrax and glanders on captured prisoners. The notes described symptoms clinically: ulcers, coughing blood, time of death. But the handwriting trembled now. The neat script of earlier years replaced by hurried scrawl. By spring, Allied bombers flew over Manchuria. The guards flinched at every engine. Ishii ordered contingency plans: burn all documents, destroy all facilities if the Soviets advanced. He built secret cremation pits behind the compound. The furnaces worked day and night. Technicians burned samples, cages, records. The smoke was thick enough to darken the snow. When the Emperor's surrender was announced on August 15, 1945, the loudspeakers in Pingfang went silent halfway through the broadcast. No one spoke. Hours later, Ishii gathered his senior officers. He told them the Americans and Soviets would arrive soon. "No evidence must remain," he said. "The experiment is over." The phrase sounded like a prayer. Prisoners were executed in their cells. Laboratories were flooded with gasoline and set alight. Flames tore through the red brick halls, shattering windows, twisting steel tables. Tanks of formalin exploded, spraying the smell of rot into the night. Soldiers dynamited the autopsy rooms. The wind carried ashes over the river. Ishii shaved his mustache, changed into civilian clothes, and vanished south under a false name. Some of his officers followed. Others were captured by the Soviets within weeks. The compound at Pingfang became a blackened shell. its chimneys still standing like tombstones. When American investigators reached Harbin months later, guided by local witnesses, they found the ruins still warm with ghosts. A few notebooks survived, temperature charts, bacterial cultures, sketches of bombs labeled UG-1 to UG-5. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and alcohol. A medic from the U.S. Army's 8th Medical Unit wrote in his diary, "The rooms are empty, but the walls remember. They photographed everything." Cracked tiles, burned vats, bone fragments fused into concrete. Then they left, carrying the papers to Tokyo. The documents would vanish into military archives, sealed under the name Project Fugu. Back in the United States, analysts at Fort Detrick began reading the reports. The handwriting was elegant, the data horrifyingly precise. Every fever, every autopsy, every death carefully measured. To some it was a crime, to others, information too valuable to waste. And in the ashes of Pingfang, snow began to fall again, covering the charred earth, soft and white, as if the world itself were trying to forget. Tokyo, 1946. The war was over, but the paperwork was still alive. In a dim office under the occupation headquarters, an American intelligence officer named Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders opened a brown folder stamped Top Secret, Japan Biological Warfare Data. Inside were the photographs taken in Manchuria, burnt lab walls, shattered glass tanks, medical tables twisted by heat. The pages beneath were written in Japanese, elegant brushstrokes that seemed too delicate for what they described. Sanders had seen the words before, Unit 731. It had appeared in scattered Soviet interrogations, in testimonies from captured officers, always whispered, never confirmed. But now he held evidence in his hands, charts of plague mortality, frostbite endurance, anthrax aerosol efficiency. It was the anatomy of evil, organized in neat columns and rows. He didn't read Japanese, but he understood numbers. He saw the pattern, and he understood what it meant. The Americans were already collecting scientists from across the defeated empire. Operation Paperclip had pulled Germany's physicists and chemists into U.S. laboratories. Now, in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur wanted the same edge. The Cold War had begun before the smoke cleared from the last battlefield, and Washington had only one rule left: get the data before the Soviets do. Shirō Ishii knew that rule before the Americans ever said it aloud. He surfaced in Tokyo like a man emerging from a grave, clean-shaven, carrying a letter of introduction from the Ministry of Health. He walked into the U.S. headquarters and requested a meeting. The interpreter's report later summarized it in one line. Japanese general offers cooperation in exchange for protection. The Americans listened. Ishii spoke politely, almost cheerfully, about his medical research. He explained that his team had conducted biological field tests and had developed valuable immunization data. When asked about human experimentation, he smiled and said, all subjects were volunteers. The room went quiet. No one believed him, but no one stopped taking notes. MacArthur's advisors debated behind closed doors. One colonel argued for arrest. He's another Mengele. Another countered, we can't afford to lose the science. The words lose and science began to mean the same thing. By late 1946, a secret memorandum left MacArthur's desk. It recommended that Japanese biological warfare data of significant military value be secured through guaranteed immunity from prosecution. The document ended with the signature of General Charles Willoughby, Chief of Intelligence. The order was approved. In the same weeks, Soviet prosecutors prepared their own trials in Khabarovsk, where captured Japanese officers confessed to everything: plague bombings, vivisections, frostbite tests. They spoke of Ishii by name. The Americans dismissed it as propaganda. Officially, the United States declared no credible evidence of war crimes by Japanese medical units. Unofficially, copies of Unit 731's notebooks were being translated in a quiet room at Fort Detrick. Maryland, the home of America's new biological warfare center, Ishii was never tried. He settled into a quiet house in Tokyo, living under an assumed position as a consultant for the National Health Agency. Several of his subordinates found new careers in universities and pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Naito Ryoichi, former bacteriologist at Pingfang, founded Green Cross. Japan's largest medical corporation. Others taught physiology at Kyoto and Tokyo medical schools, their resumes scrubbed clean by American cooperation orders. When journalists asked MacArthur's headquarters about the rumors of human experimentation, the spokesman said, "The United States does not comment on enemy propaganda." That line would hold for 40 years. Behind the scenes, Fort Detrick researchers wrote technical reports referencing unpublished Japanese data. They tested some of the methods described in the files, using animals instead of humans. Some experiments failed, some succeeded. Each page carried the legacy of the men who had promised victory through infection and were now being paid for it. In 1948, as the Nuremberg trials concluded in Europe, a handful of American officers quietly discussed whether Ishii's name should be added to the list. The answer came from Washington: no further action warranted. That phrase closed the case. The world moved on. New wars began: Korea, Vietnam. Biological warfare research continued under different names, in different buildings. And in Japan, the men of Unit 731 grew old in peace, teaching new generations of doctors who never asked where their professors had learned their techniques. But not everyone forgot. In Harbin, Chinese farmers still found bone fragments when they dug foundations. In the 1950s, Soviet scientists published parts of the Khabarovsk trial transcripts, detailing Ishii's experiments in chilling precision. The West called them fabrications, until the documents began matching American intelligence reports. By the time the truth surfaced, most of the men who had committed the crimes were already dead. In 1981, a Japanese journalist named Seiichi Morimura published The Devil's Gluttony, using leaked documents from a former Unit 731 officer. The book described everything: plague bombs, vivisections, frostbite tests. The Japanese government called it exaggerated. Survivors called it too kind. And in Washington, Fort Detrick still held sealed files marked JBW Research 1947-1952. At the end of that decade, an American historian visited the archives under declassification request. He wasn't allowed to copy anything, only to read. He later wrote in his notes, "The files do not read like fiction. They read like factory reports. Every life, every test, entered as an inventory line." When asked what became of Ishii, he said, "He died of throat cancer in 1959. Painlessly, I'm told. The man who had frozen, dissected, and infected thousands died quietly in his bed." History did not call it justice. The files stayed locked. And in the quiet halls of Fort Detrick, the word pingfang became a footnote under early biological warfare intelligence. The names of the victims were never entered. Only their temperatures, times, and infection rates. The snow in Harbin had long since melted, but the ghosts didn't. 40 years after the fires of Pingfang, the land was quiet. Factories had risen where the laboratories once stood. Children played in the fields where the plague bombs had fallen. And the last men who knew the truth were dying of old age. In Tokyo, newspapers no longer printed the word Unit 731. It lived only in rumor, in the whispered memory of nurses who had once served there, in the stories of villagers who saw black smoke rising over the river and never forgot the smell. The Japanese government called it wartime disinformation. The Americans called it classified, but some memories refused to be archived. In 1982, a farmer digging a well outside Pingfang struck metal. The spade hit a rusted cylinder that broke open, spilling dark soil and bones. Police arrived, then archaeologists, then silence. Within weeks, the area was sealed and bulldozed flat. Local witnesses said they saw men in masks carrying crates at night. The government said it was old industrial waste. The villagers called it revenants. Across the Pacific, a historian at Emory University, Sheldon Harris, requested declassification of the U.S. Army's Japanese biological warfare reports. The answer came in the usual language: denied for reasons of national security. He kept asking. Years later, a single folder arrived, thin as a whisper, pages redacted into black bars. He read what was left. Data derived from human experiments, reliable. He wrote a book called Factories of Death. Few wanted to read it. In 1989, a delegation of Chinese survivors traveled to Washington. They brought affidavits, photographs, and names. Most were old men and women, their bodies marked by the experiments they had endured as children. They asked for recognition. They didn't get it. One official said, "The United States has no jurisdiction over wartime activities of another sovereign nation." The interpreter hesitated before translating. He knew the cruelty wasn't just in the policy, but in the calmness of the tone. The survivors returned home and built their own museum in Harbin. Inside glass cases lay the remains the Earth had returned: bones, surgical tools, shards of plague bombs, fragments of glass vials etched with Japanese characters. A wall bore the names of the dead, or as many as they could remember. The list was always incomplete. The museum's first American visitor arrived in 1993. He was a journalist from Chicago, named Daniel Barron. He had served in Vietnam and thought he'd seen the worst of war. He was wrong. He walked the cold corridors, the preserved autopsy room, the vitrines filled with photographs once used as scientific evidence. In his notebook he wrote, "The rooms are clean now." The silence feels like it's still recording. That same year, a Freedom of Information Act request unearthed a memo dated May 6, 1947. It confirmed what had long been suspected. The United States had granted immunity to Ishii and his colleagues in exchange for their research results. The memo bore the initials DM, believed to be MacArthur's adjutant, General Donald Merrill. Below the signature, a single sentence: "Data now in possession of Fort Detrick to be evaluated for U.S. defensive purposes." It was the bureaucratic language of moral collapse. By then, the Cold War had ended. The world began reopening its archives, and the old ghosts came out with the dust. Japanese teachers started demanding Unit 731 be added to history textbooks. Protests erupted in Tokyo when the Education Ministry tried to erase it. Students carried signs reading, "Truth has no expiration date." In the United States, television networks produced documentaries, each ending with the same line: "The men responsible were never tried." Viewers changed the channel before the credits finished. History was easier to forget when it didn't ask for accountability. In 1997, former nurse Toyo Ishii, no relation to Shiro, broke her silence. She was 88 years old and living in a Tokyo suburb. She confessed that she had buried glass jars filled with preserved human remains behind a medical school after the war. She led investigators to the site. They found skulls, organs, and bones marked with experiment numbers. DNA testing confirmed some were Chinese and Russian. The government called the discovery unfortunate artifacts of wartime medicine. The newspapers called it proof. The American embassy offered no comment. The same year, survivors filed a civil suit in Tokyo District Court against the Japanese government. The hearings lasted 6 years. Witnesses described frostbite tests, plague infections, vivisections without anesthesia. Some broke down mid-testimony. The judges listened, nodded, and in 2002 issued their verdict. The acts described constitute undeniable atrocities, but the state cannot be held liable for wartime actions under existing law. No reparations, only words. When the survivors left the courthouse, they were met by students carrying candles. One of them, a 19-year-old from Osaka, held a sign written in English: "Science without humanity is the longest winter." A photograph of that moment ran in an American newspaper. It was printed beside an image of snow falling over the ruins of Pingfang. That same winter, declassified files from Fort Detrick finally reached public archives. Report 731A through E. They contained temperature logs, bacterial growth curves, and translation notes. Every line was precise, impersonal, perfect. The first page bore a disclaimer: "Data obtained under unusual circumstances. Reliability high. Ethical context uncertain." The handwriting at the bottom read simply, "Reviewed, M. Sanders." It had come full circle. The man who had opened the first folder in 1946 had signed off on the last. By the turn of the millennium, Unit 731 was no longer a rumor. It was a wound in the open air. Museums in China displayed its instruments. Documentaries played on late-night American television. And Japanese textbooks, under pressure, finally included a single paragraph. Certain wartime medical experiments were conducted by the Imperial Army in occupied territories. Details remain under study. That line became the epitaph of thousands. Every empire buries its sins in different soil. The Soviets buried theirs in Khabarovsk, the Japanese in textbooks, and the Americans in Fort Detrick's archives. But the frost of Pingfang still lingers in every page of science that forgets its cost. The last known survivor of Unit 731's victims died in 2014. His granddaughter placed a candle by his grave and whispered the word he never spoke aloud, justice. The flame flickered in the wind and went out. Not because it was weak, but because the night was still full of breath from a world that once called this medicine.